Broken Mesa Ridge. Loretta Lori Boone had spent her life keeping her family's ranch out of trouble, but when her father's debt came due, it was Bo Slade, the most feared cattle baron in the county, who came to collect. He smirked, tipping his hat. "Your daddy lost the land, sweetheart," he murmured. "But I'm willin' to strike a new deal with you." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Spur's Decree. The dust swirled, a miniature cyclone kicked up by the hooves of Bo Slade's stallion as he reined in sharply before the porch of the Boone homestead. Loretta Boone watched from the weathered wooden planks, her hand instinctively tightening on the worn handle of the Winchester rifle she'd propped against the railing. Her heart hammered a rhythm of defiance and dread against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the slow, deliberate creak of leather as Slade dismounted. He moved with the predatory grace of a mountain cat, each step measured and confident, his presence dominating the sprawling yard that had, until this moment, felt like the safest place in the world to Lori. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the sun and, she suspected, by a hardness that had only intensified with time. He wore the trappings of a successful cattle baron, expensive, if dusty, boots, a finely tailored shirt beneath a worn leather vest, and a silver-buckled belt that glinted in the harsh afternoon light. But it was the spurs, the infamous silver spurs with their wickedly sharp rowels, that drew her gaze and held it. They were a symbol, a declaration of his power, and a chilling reminder of the debt her father had left unpaid. Lori was 57, her life a tapestry woven with the threads of hard work, resilience, and the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered more than her share of storms. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, pulled back tightly in a practical braid that fell halfway down her back. The sun had etched lines on her face, a map of laughter and sorrow, but her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, still held a spark of defiance, a refusal to be broken. She'd inherited the ranch from her father, along with his debts, a burden she'd carried with the stoicism of a woman accustomed to shouldering responsibility. "Lori," Slade's voice was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very planks of the porch. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat, a gesture that was more mockery than politeness.
"Been a while."
"Bo," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. "You're trespassing." A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, the color of cold steel, assessed her, lingering on the rifle she held, then moving to the lines of her worn, but sturdy, cotton dress. "Am I now? Seems to me, Miss Boone, that this land, this ranch belongs to me." The words, though expected, struck her like a physical blow. She'd known this day was coming, had dreaded it for months, ever since the lawyer's letter had arrived, stark and uncompromising, outlining the terms of her father's defaulted loan. Her father, a man of dreams and grand schemes, had always been a better gambler than a rancher. He'd borrowed heavily from Slade, using the ranch as collateral, a desperate gamble that had, predictably, failed. "My father's debt," Lori began, her voice tight, "was his own. It shouldn't fall on me." Slade chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. "The law, sweetheart, doesn't care much for sentiment. Your daddy signed the papers."
He knew the stakes.
He paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. "He lost the land, sweetheart. Fair and square." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her, long and menacing. "But I'm a reasonable man, Lori. Always have been." She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to flinch under his scrutiny. "What do you want, Bo?" He reached out, his fingers brushing against the worn wood of the porch railing, inches from her hand. The proximity was unnerving, the scent of leather and dust and something else, something wild and untamed, filling her senses. "Your daddy lost the land," he repeated, his voice softer now, almost a purr. "But I'm willin' to strike a new deal with you." The implication hung in the air, thick and heavy with unspoken possibilities. Lori's grip tightened on the rifle. She knew what he was suggesting, what he expected. She'd heard the whispers, the rumors that followed Beau Slade like a shadow rumors of his ruthlessness, his insatiable hunger for land and power, and his appreciation for women who caught his eye. Her stomach churned, a knot of disgust and fear tightening within her. She would rather die than become another notch on his belt, another conquest to be bragged about in the smoky saloons of Dusty Gulch. But the ranch, the thought of losing it, of seeing her family's legacy swallowed up by Slade's greed, was a pain almost too unbearable to contemplate. She looked out across the land, her gaze sweeping over the rolling hills, the grazing cattle, the distant mountains shimmering in the heat haze. This was her life, her heritage, the only home she'd ever known. It was more than just land, it was the embodiment of her family's struggles, their triumphs, their very existence. "What kind of deal?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Slade's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "A deal that benefits us both, Lori. A deal that keeps this ranch in your hands and keeps me entertained." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "You're a strong woman, Lori. A beautiful woman. I admire that. And I think we could come to a mutually agreeable arrangement." Lori felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, burning away the fear. She raised the rifle, the barrel pointing squarely at his chest. "Get off my land, Slade." He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He simply stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of amusement and something else, something that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. "You wouldn't shoot me, Lori. You're not a killer." "Try me," she said, her voice shaking, but her hand remained steady. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with tension. Then, slowly, he straightened up, taking a step back. "I'll give you time to think about it, Lori. But don't take too long. My patience and my offer have limits." He turned and walked back to his horse, his spurs jingling with every step, a sound that echoed in Lori's ears long after he'd ridden away, leaving her standing alone in the dust, the weight of his words and the shadow of his spurs hanging heavy over her heart. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the porch. What would she do? Chapter 2. Dust and Whispered Debts. The smell of coffee, strong and bitter, filled the small, sparsely furnished kitchen. Loretta sat at the worn wooden table, a single kerosene lamp casting a flickering circle of light around her. Outside, the night was a vast, inky blackness, punctuated by the distant howl of a coyote and the rustle of the wind through the dry grasses. She hadn't slept, not a wink. Slade's words, his proposition, had replayed in her mind endlessly, each repetition a fresh wave of anger and despair. She stared at the chipped enamel mug in her hands, the warmth seeping through the porcelain, a small comfort in the face of the overwhelming uncertainty that loomed before her. The ranch had been her life, her sanctuary. She'd learned to ride before she could walk, had helped her father brand cattle, mend fences, and deliver calves in the dead of night. She'd known hardship, had faced down blizzards, droughts, and rustlers, but she'd always done it with a sense of purpose, a deep-rooted connection to the land and the legacy she was determined to protect. Her father, bless his soul, had been a dreamer, a man who chased rainbows and often stumbled over reality. He'd loved the ranch in his own way, but he'd lacked the practicality, the ruthlessness needed to survive in this harsh, unforgiving country. He'd seen the land as a source of potential riches, a means to fund his extravagant schemes, rather than as a living, breathing entity that demanded respect and unwavering dedication. Lori had tried to temper his recklessness, to instill in him a sense of caution, but her pleas had often fallen on deaf ears. He'd always had a charming smile, a way of making her feel guilty for doubting him, for not sharing his unwavering optimism. And she had loved him fiercely, despite his flaws. Now he was gone, and she was left to clean up the mess, to face the consequences of his choices. She traced the rim of the mug with her finger, her thoughts drifting back to the lawyer's letter, the cold, legal language that had spelled out her predicament. She'd sought advice from old Jedediah, the town lawyer, a wizened man who had known her father for years. "He left you in a tight spot, Lori," Jedediah had said, his voice raspy with age and regret. "Slade's got him, hook, line, and sinker. That contract your daddy signed, it's ironclad. He's got the right to foreclose. There has to be something I can do," she'd pleaded, desperation lacing her voice. Jedediah had shaken his head slowly. "You could try to borrow the money, pay off the debt. But who'd lend that kind of sum to a woman alone, running a ranch that's already mortgaged to the hilt?" He'd paused, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. "Slade, he's a hard man, Lori. But he's not unreasonable. He likes to get what he wants, and he usually does." The memory of Jedediah's words, the weight of his resignation, settled heavily on her shoulders. She knew the truth of it. She'd seen the way Slade operated, the way he'd slowly but surely acquired land and power throughout the county, swallowing up smaller ranches, leaving a trail of broken dreams and shattered lives in his wake. She rose from the table, the chair scraping against the wooden floor, a harsh sound in the quiet kitchen. She walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon, a sliver of silver in the vast expanse of sky, cast a pale, ethereal glow over the landscape. She could see the outline of the barn, the corrals, the water trough, all silent and still under the watchful gaze of the stars. She thought of her mother, buried on a small hill overlooking the ranch, her grave marked by a simple wooden cross. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering faith, had taught her the value of hard work, of perseverance, of holding on to hope even in the darkest of times. She wondered what her mother would say, what advice she would offer. A sudden sound, the snap of a twig, brought her back to the present. She strained her ears, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. She reached for the rifle she'd left leaning against the wall near the door, her heart pounding in her chest. It could be anything, a stray animal, a coyote scavenging for food. But the memory of Slade's eyes, his predatory smile, filled her with a sense of unease. She slipped out the back door, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. She circled around the side of the house, her senses on high alert. She saw him then, a figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. He was standing near the corral, his back to her, seemingly studying the horses. He was tall and lean, his posture relaxed, but there was something about the way he held himself, a sense of coiled energy, that made her wary. She raised the rifle, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The figure turned, slowly, and Lori's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Beau Slade. It was a younger man, a stranger, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to reflect the starlight. He held his hands up, palms open, in a gesture of peace. He didn't speak, a strange look on his face as the moon revealed his features. He needed help. But who was he? And what was he doing on her land? The answer, she knew, would decide everything. Chapter 3. A bargain struck under the blazing sun. He lowered his hands slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. They were dark, almost black in the moonlight, and held a depth of sadness that surprised her. He didn't look like a threat, not like a rustler or one of Slade's hired guns. He looked lost. I didn't mean to startle you, ma'am," he said, his voice low and hesitant, with a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "I saw the light. I needed help." Lori kept the rifle trained on him, her fingers still on the trigger. "What kind of help?" He gestured towards his horse, a weary-looking mare standing nearby, its head drooping.
"My horse, she's gone lame.
"I've been walking for hours." "I saw your ranch." I hoped he trailed off, his voice thick with exhaustion. Lori studied him, her gaze sweeping over his worn clothes, his dusty boots, the lines of fatigue etched on his face. He looked like he'd been through hell and back. There was a sincerity in his eyes, a vulnerability that made her question her initial suspicion.
"Who are you?"
she asked, her voice still guarded, but softening slightly. "Name's Caleb," he replied.
Caleb O'Connell.
The name meant nothing to her. He wasn't from around here, that much was clear. "What are you doing in these parts, Caleb O'Connell?" He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Passing through," he said finally, his voice evasive. "Heading west." Lori knew he wasn't telling her the whole truth, but she also knew the weariness of a long journey, the desperation of needing help in the middle of nowhere. She'd been there herself, more than once. She lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't put it down. "There's a water trough over there," she said, gesturing with her head. "Get your horse some water. Then come inside. I'll see what I can do for her." He nodded, relief flooding his features.
"Thank you, ma'am.
"I appreciate it." He led his horse to the trough, letting her drink her fill. Lori watched him, her mind racing. She was taking a risk, a big one. She knew nothing about this man, this stranger who had appeared out of the darkness. But something in his eyes, in his demeanor, told her he wasn't a threat. And she couldn't, in good conscience, turn away someone in need, especially not in this desolate country. After he'd watered his horse, he followed her back to the house, his steps slow and heavy. Inside, the kerosene lamp cast a warm glow over the kitchen, revealing the lines of exhaustion on his face more clearly. He looked younger than she'd first thought, maybe early 30s, but his eyes held the weariness of someone much older. "Sit down," she said, gesturing towards the table. "I'll make some coffee." He sat down heavily, his gaze sweeping over the simple, but clean, kitchen. "You live here alone, ma'am?" Lori busied herself with the coffee pot, avoiding his gaze. "I do," she said shortly. He didn't press her, didn't ask any more questions. He simply sat there, silent and still, watching her as she moved around the kitchen. She poured him a mug of coffee, the strong aroma filling the room. "Thank you," he said, taking a sip. "This is good." She sat down across from him, her own mug in her hands. "What happened to your horse?" He explained that he'd been riding for days, pushing his horse hard, trying to outrun something. He didn't say what, and Lori didn't ask. He'd hit a stretch of rocky ground, and the mare had stumbled, injuring her leg. Lori examined the horse's leg the following morning, under a blistering sun. The swelling had gone down slightly, but it was clear the mare needed rest. Caleb watched her, his expression anxious. "She'll be all right," Lori said, straightening up. "But she won't be able to travel for a while. At least a week, maybe more." Caleb's shoulders slumped. I don't know what to do." Lori looked at him, her gaze thoughtful. She had a proposition, a crazy idea that had been forming in her mind since she'd first seen him. It was a risk, a gamble, but it might be the only way to save her ranch. "I need help," she said, her voice firm. "I'm running this ranch alone. It's more than I can handle." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'll let you stay here, help you care for your horse. In return, you work for me." His eyes widened in surprise. "Work for you, ma'am?" "Yes," she said. "Help me with the ranch. The cattle, the fences, everything. It's hard work, but it's honest work." He considered her offer, his gaze searching hers. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Lori said, her voice unwavering. "It's a fair deal. And it's the only one you're likely to get." He looked out across the ranch, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of land, the rolling hills, the distant mountains. He saw the challenge, the hardship, but he also saw something else: opportunity. A chance to start over, to leave behind whatever he was running from. He turned back to Lori, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I accept, ma'am. I'll work for you. I'll do whatever you need." A faint smile touched Lori's lips.
"Good," she said.
"Then we have a deal." It wasn't the deal she'd expected to make, not the one Bo Slade had offered. This was different. This was a bargain struck under the blazing sun, a pact between two strangers, bound by necessity and a shared hope for a future that was still uncertain, but, for the first time in a long time, felt possible. The sun beat down, relentless and unforgiving, and Lori knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. Echoes of Loss and New Beginnings. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Caleb proved to be a strong and capable worker, throwing himself into the demanding tasks of ranch life with a quiet intensity that both impressed and intrigued Lori. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He mended fences, repaired the corral, herded cattle, and even helped Lori with the endless chores around the house, all without complaint. He was skilled with horses, possessing a gentle touch and a keen understanding of their nature. He nursed his mare back to health, patiently tending to her injured leg, talking to her in low, soothing tones. Lori watched him, observing the way he moved, the way he interacted with the animals, the way he seemed to find solace in the simple, demanding rhythm of ranch life. She learned more about him, slowly, in bits and pieces. He'd grown up on a small farm in the east, had lost his family to illness, and had drifted west, searching for something. He never spoke about his past in detail, always deflecting her questions with a shrug or a change of subject. But she saw the shadows in his eyes, the lingering sadness that hinted at a deeper pain, a loss that he carried with him like a heavy burden. Lori, too, found herself opening up, sharing stories about her own life, her childhood on the ranch, her dreams, her disappointments. She hadn't talked this much to anyone in years, not since her father had passed. It felt good to share the weight of her burdens, to have someone listen, to have someone understand. They developed a comfortable routine, a silent understanding that transcended words. They worked side by side, sharing meals, exchanging quiet glances, building a connection that was based on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for the hard, demanding beauty of the land. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. "It's beautiful here," Caleb said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Peaceful." Lori nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is," she agreed. "But it's also unforgiving. It demands respect." "Like life," Caleb said, turning to look at her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. There was a connection there, a spark of something that went beyond friendship, beyond the employer-employee relationship. It was a flicker of understanding, of shared experience, of two souls who had known hardship and loss, finding solace in each other's presence. Lori felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that spread through her body. She hadn't felt this way in years, not since she pushed the thought away, unwilling to dwell on the past. "I should get inside," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "It's getting late." Caleb nodded, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer before he turned back to the sunset. "Good night, Lori," he said. "Good night, Caleb," she replied, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She went inside, closing the door behind her, but the image of his eyes, the warmth of his gaze, stayed with her. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her thoughts a jumble of emotions. She was grateful for Caleb's help, for his presence, for the way he had eased the burden of running the ranch alone. But there was something more, something that stirred within her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge for a long time. She knew she was playing with fire, that getting close to Caleb was a risk. She was still vulnerable, still facing the threat of Bo Slade, still struggling to hold onto her ranch. She couldn't afford to be distracted, to let her emotions cloud her judgment. But as she drifted off to sleep, the image of Caleb's face, his gentle smile, his dark, soulful eyes, filled her dreams. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of something that felt like possibility. The possibilities, however, felt dangerous, like a prairie fire waiting for a spark. It would only take one thing. Chapter 5. The Weight of a Father's Legacy. The old trunk sat in the corner of the attic, gathering dust. Lori hadn't opened it in years, not since her father's death. It was filled with his belongings, his memories, the remnants of a life that had been both grand and tragically flawed. She'd avoided it, unwilling to confront the emotions it held, the bittersweet ache of love and disappointment. But today, she felt compelled to open it, to delve into the past, to search for something. She wasn't sure what. Perhaps a clue, a hidden document, anything that might help her understand her father's dealings with Bo Slade, anything that might give her an edge in the battle to save her ranch. The attic was hot and stuffy, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The only light came from a small, grimy window, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Lori knelt before the trunk, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the heavy lid. The smell of old leather and mothballs wafted up, a familiar scent that instantly transported her back to her childhood. She saw her father, younger and more vibrant, his eyes sparkling with mischief, his laughter echoing through the house. She remembered him teaching her to ride, to shoot, to appreciate the beauty of the land. He'd been a flawed man, but he'd loved her in his own way. She began to sift through the contents of the trunk, carefully lifting out each item, examining it with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. There were old photographs, faded and cracked, depicting her family in happier times. There were letters, tied together with faded ribbon, written in her mother's elegant script. There were trinkets, souvenirs from her father's travels, each one holding a story, a memory. She found his old journal, a leather-bound book filled with his sprawling handwriting. She began to read, her heart aching with each entry. He wrote about his dreams, his ambitions, his hopes for the ranch. He wrote about his love for her mother, his pride in his daughter. But he also wrote about his struggles, his debts, his growing desperation. She found several entries that mentioned Bo Slade, each one filled with a mixture of resentment and begrudging respect. He described Slade as a ruthless businessman, a man who knew how to exploit weakness, a man who always got what he wanted. He wrote about the loan, the crippling interest rates, the growing pressure he felt to repay it. Slade has me cornered, he wrote in one entry. He's like a vulture, circling, waiting for me to fail. I fear I've made a terrible mistake, a mistake that may cost me everything. Lori felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards Slade for preying on her father's vulnerability, for driving him to the brink of despair. But she also felt a pang of guilt, a nagging feeling that she should have done more, that she should have been able to save him. She continued to search, digging deeper into the trunk, hoping to find something, anything, that might help her. And then she found it. At the very bottom of the trunk, hidden beneath a pile of old clothes, she found a small, wooden box. She lifted it out, her heart pounding in her chest. It was locked, but the key was attached to the lid with a small, tarnished chain. She unlocked the box, her hands shaking with anticipation. Inside, she found a single document, folded neatly and tied with a piece of string. She carefully unfolded it, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a deed, a land grant, dating back several generations. It described a parcel of land, a significant piece of property that bordered the Boone Ranch, a piece of property that her father had apparently owned, but had never mentioned to her. And then she saw the name of the person who had signed the deed, the name of the person who had apparently sold the land to her father. It was Bo Slade's father. The document indicated, however, something was very wrong with the sale, something that alluded to forged signatures and illegal transfers. This changes the legacy. This alters the truth. She had a weapon, but she had no idea if it could be trusted or how to wield it. Chapter 6. Between the Law and Loyalty. Lori rode into Dusty Gulch, the small, weathered town that served as the hub of the county. The deed, carefully folded and tucked inside her saddlebag, felt like a burning coal against her side. It was a gamble, a long shot, but it was the only hope she had. The town was bustling with activity, the streets filled with cowboys, ranchers, and merchants. The air was thick with the smell of dust, horses, and the smoky aroma of a saloon. Lori headed straight for Jedediah's office, a small, unassuming building tucked away on a side street. Jedediah greeted her with a weary smile, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and resignation. He'd known her since she was a child, had watched her grow up, had witnessed her struggles and her resilience. He knew the weight of the burden she carried, the threat that Bo Slade posed to her future. Lori, he said, his voice raspy. What brings you to town? She didn't waste any time. She pulled out the deed, carefully unfolding it and placing it on his desk. I found this, she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. In my father's belongings. Jedediah picked up the deed, his eyes widening as he scanned the faded ink. He read it slowly, carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up at Lori, his expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice hushed. In an old trunk, she replied. Hidden at the bottom. He reread the document, his fingers tracing the signatures, the dates, the legal descriptions. This changes everything, Lori, he said finally, his voice filled with a newfound energy. This deed, it suggests that your father owned a significant piece of land that Slade claims is his. I know, Lori said. But there's something else. Look at the signatures. The dates. Something isn't right. Jedediah examined the document more closely, his eyes narrowing. You're right, he said. The signature of Slade's father, it looks forged. And the date, it's after he supposedly died. Lori felt a surge of hope, a flicker of excitement. This was it. This was the evidence she needed to challenge Slade, to fight back, to save her ranch. But she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. Slade was a powerful man, a man with connections, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to protect his interests. What do we do? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Jedediah leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. We need to proceed carefully, Lori, he said. Slade won't give up without a fight. He'll have lawyers, he'll have influence. He'll try to discredit this deed, to claim it's a forgery. But it's not, Lori said, her voice firm. I know it's not. My father wouldn't have, he couldn't have, she trailed off, unable to articulate the emotions that were churning inside her. I believe you, Lori, Jedediah said, his voice gentle. But believing isn't enough. We need proof. We need to build a case, a strong case that can stand up to Slade's scrutiny. He outlined a plan, a strategy that involved gathering evidence, contacting witnesses, and preparing for a legal battle that could be long, arduous, and costly. It was a daunting prospect, but Lori was determined. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let Slade win. I'm ready, she said, her voice unwavering. I'll do whatever it takes. Jedediah smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I know you will, Lori, he said. You've got your father's spirit in you. And that's a powerful weapon. As Lori left Jedediah's office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a surge of determination. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she wasn't alone. She had Jedediah, she had Caleb, and she had the truth on her side. She mounted her horse, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town, but Lori didn't see the darkness. She saw the light, the glimmer of hope that had been rekindled by the discovery of the deed. She rode back to the ranch, her heart filled with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. The battle was about to begin, a battle for her land, her legacy, her future. And she was ready to fight. But as she neared the ranch, she saw a figure standing in the yard, a figure she recognized instantly.
Boslad.
And he was not alone. Several rough-looking men flanked him, their hands resting on the holsters of their guns. The weight of loyalty, she realized, now rested on her shoulders. She had to protect Caleb. She had to protect her land. Chapter 7. The unforgiving gaze of Beau Slade. Slade watched her approach, a smirk playing on his lips. He stood with his legs slightly apart, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, a posture of casual arrogance that was designed to intimidate. His men, a collection of hard-faced ruffians, flanked him like a pack of wolves, their eyes cold and menacing. Well, Slade said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what the cat dragged in. Back from town, Miss Boone? Lori reined in her horse a few yards from him, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle she carried in her saddle scabbard. She didn't draw it, but she wanted him to know she wasn't afraid. What do you want, Slade? She asked, her voice steady and defiant. His smirk widened. "I came to see how you were doing," he said, his voice mocking. "To see if you'd come to your senses yet." "I told you," Lori said, her voice tight. "I'm not interested in your deal." His eyes narrowed, the amusement fading from his face. "You're making a mistake, Lori," he said, his voice low and threatening. "A big mistake. You can't win this. I own this ranch. I own the land. I own everything." "Not everything," Lori said, her voice unwavering. She reached into her saddlebag, pulling out the deed, carefully unfolded. She held it up, letting him see it. "I found this," she said. "It seems my father owned a piece of land you claim is yours. A piece of land your father supposedly sold him after he died." Slade's eyes flickered, a flicker of surprise, of uncertainty. But it was quickly replaced by a mask of cold fury. He took a step towards her, his hand moving towards his gun. "That's a lie," he said, his voice a low growl. "That's a forgery. You're trying to cheat me." "Am I?" Lori said, her voice calm, despite the pounding of her heart. "Or are you trying to cheat me? Are you trying to steal what's rightfully mine?" His men shifted nervously, their hands tightening on their guns. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. Lori knew she was playing a dangerous game, that one wrong move could lead to violence. But she wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let him intimidate her. "Get off my land, Slade," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "And take your men with you." He stared at her, his eyes filled with hatred. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he hesitated. He looked at the deed, then back at Lori, his gaze calculating. He knew he was in a precarious position. He knew that if the deed was genuine, it could ruin him. He turned to his men, his face a mask of cold fury. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight. "We're leaving." They mounted their horses, their movements stiff and angry. Slade turned back to Lori, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and something else. Something that looked like fear. "This isn't over, Lori," he said, his voice a low threat. "I'll be back. And I'll take what's mine." He spurred his horse, galloping away, his men following close behind. Lori watched them go, her heart still pounding in her chest. She knew this was just the beginning, that Slade wouldn't give up easily. But she also knew that she had a fighting chance. She had the deed, she had Jedediah, and she had Caleb. She looked around a yard, her gaze searching for him. She saw him then, standing near the barn, his rifle in his hands, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. He walked towards her, his eyes meeting hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's not over. Slade will be back." Caleb nodded, his gaze hardening. "I know," he said. "And we'll be ready for him." He stood beside her, his presence a source of strength and comfort. Lori looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and something more. Something that was growing stronger with each passing day, something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The gaze, however, was more than just hers. Caleb looked at her, and Lori recognized the intensity. He wouldn't leave. He would stand with her. This, she knew, changed everything once again. Chapter 8. Secrets etched in the frontier wind. The days that followed were filled with a tense anticipation. Lori and Caleb worked tirelessly, preparing for Slade's inevitable return. They strengthened the defenses of the ranch, reinforcing the fences, securing the barn, and setting up a system of watchtowers. They practiced their shooting, honing their skills, preparing for a confrontation that could come at any moment. Caleb revealed a surprising proficiency with firearms, a skill that hinted at a past he still refused to discuss. He moved with a confidence, a precision that suggested he was no stranger to violence. Lori watched him, her curiosity growing, her questions unanswered. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" she asked him one evening, as they sat on the porch, cleaning their rifles. He shrugged, his gaze evasive.
"Just picked it up," he said.
"Living on the frontier, you learn to defend yourself." Lori knew he wasn't telling her the whole truth, but she didn't press him. She respected his privacy, his right to keep his secrets. But she also sensed that his past was somehow connected to his present, that the skills he possessed were more than just a matter of survival. They spent their evenings talking, sharing stories, getting to know each other better. Lori learned about his childhood on the farm, his love for his family, his dreams of a better life. Caleb listened intently as she spoke about her own life, her struggles, her hopes for the future. They discovered a shared love for the land, a deep appreciation for the beauty and the harshness of the frontier. They found comfort in each other's company, a sense of connection that transcended their circumstances. One evening, as they sat by the campfire, Caleb told her about a recurring dream he'd been having, a dream of running, of being chased by something he couldn't see, something that filled him with terror. "It's always the same," he said, his voice troubled. "I'm running through a forest. The trees are tall and dark, and I can hear something behind me, something gaining on me. I can't see it, but I can feel it, its presence, its evil." Lori listened, her heart aching for him. She knew the feeling of being haunted by the past, of being chased by shadows. She'd had her own nightmares, her own demons to contend with. "What do you think it means?" she asked, her voice gentle. He shook his head.
"I don't know," he said.
"But it feels real. It feels like a warning." Lori reached out, her hand covering his. "You're safe here, Caleb," she said. "Whatever you're running from, it can't hurt you here." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. He squeezed her hand, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her body. "Thank you, Lori," he said. "For everything." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, the crackling fire, the vast, starlit sky above. Lori felt a pull towards him, a connection that was undeniable. She knew she was falling for him, falling hard. It was reckless, dangerous, but she couldn't help herself. He was everything she'd ever wanted in a man, strong, kind, courageous, and vulnerable. But she also knew that their future was uncertain, that Slade's threat still loomed over them, that their newfound happiness could be shattered at any moment. The secrets etched in the wind, however, went far beyond just Caleb's dreams. The land held secrets. Lori's father had secrets. And, as she would soon learn, those secrets were about to collide in a way that would change the entire landscape of their lives. It was a secret, she thought, that went to the very heart of Beau Slade. Chapter 9. A dance of defiance and desire. The tension between Lori and Caleb grew, a silent, unspoken acknowledgement of the feelings that were blossoming between them. They worked side by side, their hands brushing, their eyes meeting, the air around them charged with an electricity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. One afternoon, they were repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a storm. The sun was beating down, the air was thick with the smell of dust and sweat. Caleb was working shirtless, his muscles rippling as he hammered the posts into the ground. Lori watched him, her gaze lingering on the lines of his body, the strength and grace of his movements. He caught her looking, his eyes meeting hers. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver of heat through her body. She blushed, turning away, pretending to be busy with the wire. "You're staring, Lori," he said, his voice low and teasing. I wasn't," she stammered, her cheeks burning. He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that made her heart skip a beat. He moved closer, his presence filling her senses. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentle. "I don't mind." She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was a warmth there, a tenderness that melted her defenses. She felt a pull towards him, an irresistible force that drew her closer. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her body. "Lori," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. She felt his breath on her face, the warmth of his body close to hers. She knew she shouldn't, that it was dangerous, that it could complicate everything. But she couldn't help herself. She wanted him, more than she'd ever wanted anything. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a gentle exploration, a question asked and answered. Lori responded, her lips parting, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a release of pent-up emotions, of unspoken desires, of the fear and uncertainty that had been hanging over them. It was a dance of defiance and desire, a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. The world seemed to stand still, the only sound the pounding of their hearts. "Caleb," Lori whispered, her voice trembling. He touched her face, his fingers tracing the lines of her cheek, her jaw, her lips. He began, but he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. They stood there for a long moment, lost in each other's gaze. The reality of their situation, the threat of Bo Slade, the uncertainty of their future, seemed to fade away, replaced by the overwhelming intensity of their connection. But the moment couldn't last. A distant sound, the sound of approaching horses, shattered the spell. They pulled apart, their eyes widening in alarm. "Slade," Caleb said, his voice grim. "He's back." Lori nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The dance was over. The battle was about to begin. She grabbed her rifle, her hand steady, her resolve firm. She would fight for her ranch, for her future, and for Caleb. She knew, however, that this time Slade would not back down. This time, it was a fight to the finish, spurred on by something far deeper than land, a secret that bound them all to the dust and legacy of this wild, unforgiving frontier. The defiance, she felt, was turning into an unbridled rage. Chapter 10. The Thorns of a Hidden Rose. Slade arrived with a larger contingent of men, their faces grim, their guns drawn. They surrounded the ranch house, their presence a menacing threat. Lori and Caleb stood on the porch, their rifles ready, their faces set in determined lines. "Lori," Slade called out, his voice amplified by the silence of the surrounding landscape. "I'm here to take what's mine. Come out, and no one gets hurt." Lori stepped forward, her voice ringing with defiance. "This ranch is not yours, Slade," she said. "And I'm not afraid of you." He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You should be," he said. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. You can't win." "We'll see about that," Caleb said, stepping forward to stand beside Lori. His voice was calm, but his eyes were filled with a cold fury. Slade's gaze shifted to Caleb, his eyes narrowing. "You," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're the drifter. The one who's been helping her." Caleb didn't reply, his silence a challenge in itself. Slade turned back to Lori. "I'm giving you one last chance, Lori," he said. "Come out peacefully, and I'll let you live. Maybe even let you keep a small piece of land. For old time's sake." Lori knew he was lying, that he would never let her keep anything. He wanted it all, and he would stop at nothing to get it. She thought of the deed, the evidence that could expose his lies, his treachery. But she also knew that revealing it now would put her and Caleb in even greater danger. "I have nothing to say to you, Slade," she said, her voice unwavering. He sighed, a theatrical gesture of resignation. "So be it," he said. "You've made your choice." He raised his hand, a signal to his men. They opened fire, bullets whizzing past Lori and Caleb, splintering the wood of the porch. Lori and Caleb returned fire, their shots finding their marks, sending several of Slade's men sprawling to the ground. The battle raged, a chaotic exchange of gunfire and shouts. Lori and Caleb fought with a courage and determination born of desperation. They were outnumbered, but they were fighting for something more than just land. They were fighting for their lives, for their future, for each other. As the fighting intensified, Lori noticed something, a detail that had escaped her attention before. One of Slade's men, a man with a distinctive scar above his eye, was holding back, not firing his gun. He was watching the battle with a troubled expression, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. Lori recognized him. He was one of the men who had been present when her father had supposedly signed the loan agreement with Slade. He was a witness, a key to unlocking the truth. She saw an opportunity, a chance to turn the tide of the battle. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. "Hold your fire," she shouted, her voice ringing out across the yard. "I want to talk to you, Scarface. I know you were there. You saw what happened." The man hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. He looked at Slade, then back at Lori, his expression conflicted. Slade saw what was happening. He turned to the man, his eyes filled with rage. "Don't listen to her," he shouted. "She's lying. Kill her." But the man didn't move. He stood there, frozen, his conscience battling with his fear. This man knew the truth about her father's interactions, all those years ago. A truth that would reveal something far darker than a simple business deal. Lori pressed her advantage. "Tell the truth," she pleaded. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them how Slade cheated my father. Tell them about the forged deed." The man looked at Slade, his eyes filled with a newfound defiance. He took a deep breath, and then he spoke. "It's true," he said, his voice trembling. "I saw it." Slade, he forced Lori's father to sign. Threatened him. Threatened his family. The words were choked, full of years of pent-up fear. "And the deed," the man continued, his words a pained whisper. "It was forged." Slade's father, he was already dead. A tear rolled down his cheek, the hidden rose, finally exposed. Its thorns, however, would now pierce everyone. Chapter 11. Scars of the Past, Whispers of the Future. The man's confession hung in the air, a stunning revelation that silenced the gunfire. Slade's men looked at him, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Slade himself stood frozen, his expression a mask of rage and fear. "You're lying," Slade shouted, his voice desperate. "He's lying. Kill them. Kill them all." But his men hesitated, their loyalty wavering. They had seen the truth in the man's eyes, heard the pain in his voice. They had been pawns in Slade's game, used and manipulated for his own selfish gain. Caleb stepped forward, his rifle trained on Slade. "It's over, Slade," he said, his voice cold and steady. "You're finished." Slade's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, a way out. But there was none. He was surrounded, his lies exposed, his power shattered. He made a desperate move, lunging for his gun, but Caleb was faster. He fired, the shot ringing out across the yard. Slade stumbled, clutching his chest, his eyes widening in disbelief. He fell to the ground, his body still, his reign of terror finally over. The remaining men, seeing their leader defeated, surrendered, dropping their weapons. The battle was over. Lori had won. She stood there, trembling, her body exhausted, her mind reeling from the events that had transpired. She had saved her ranch, exposed Slade's treachery, and avenged her father's death. But the victory felt bittersweet. The cost had been high, the scars of the past reopened. She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. He had stood by her, fought for her, risked his life for her. He was more than just a hired hand, more than just a friend. He was her partner, her soulmate, the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Caleb walked towards her, his eyes meeting hers. He reached out, taking her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her body. "It's over, Lori," he said, his voice gentle. "You're safe now." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "We did it," she whispered. Together. They embraced, holding each other tight, finding solace in each other's arms. The future was still uncertain, but they had each other. And that was all that mattered. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of relief and reflection. Lori and Caleb worked to repair the damage to the ranch, to heal the wounds of the battle. They buried Slade, a simple, unmarked grave, a testament to his ignominious end. The man with the scar, whose name was Thomas, agreed to testify against Slade, to help Lori clear her father's name and secure her claim to the land. He revealed the details of Slade's scheme, the forged deed, the threats, the manipulation. He spoke of his own guilt, his regret for being a part of it. Jedediah, with Thomas's testimony and the evidence of the deed, was able to build a strong case, proving Laurie's ownership of the ranch and exposing Slade's crimes. The court ruled in Laurie's favor, restoring her family's legacy and bringing justice to her father's memory. Laurie and Caleb stood together, hand in hand, as the judge announced the verdict. They had faced the storm, weathered the darkness, and emerged victorious. As they walked out of the courthouse, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the town, Laurie felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. The scars of the past would always be there, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of her strength, her resilience, and the love that had helped her through the darkest of times. The whispers, however, were just beginning. Caleb had a past to reveal, and Laurie's father had more secrets that were about to be unearthed. Chapter 12. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Love. With Slade gone and the ranch secure, Laurie and Caleb began to rebuild their lives, their relationship deepening with each passing day. They worked side by side, restoring the ranch to its former glory, their shared labor a testament to their love and commitment. But the past, like a persistent shadow, still lingered. Caleb remained guarded about his history, deflecting Laurie's questions with vague answers and evasive smiles. She respected his privacy, but she also sensed a growing unease, a feeling that his secrets were a barrier between them, a wall that prevented them from fully connecting. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast, inky sky, Laurie decided to broach the subject again. "Caleb," she said, her voice gentle, "you know you can trust me, right? You can tell me anything." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and pain. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Laurie," he said. It's hard. It's not something I like to talk about." "I understand," she said. "But it's hurting you, Caleb. And it's hurting us. I need to know who you are, where you came from, what you're running from." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Then, slowly, he began to speak, his voice low and hesitant, his words painting a picture of a life far removed from the quiet serenity of the ranch. He told her about his childhood, growing up in a bustling city, his family involved in business. He didn't specify what kind of business, but Laurie sensed it was something dangerous, something illegal. He spoke of his father, a powerful man, a man who ruled with an iron fist, a man who demanded absolute loyalty. He told her about a betrayal, a conflict that had erupted within the family, a bloody feud that had left many dead, including his brother. He had been forced to flee, to run for his life, to escape the wrath of his own father. "He blamed me," Caleb said, his voice choked with emotion. "He blamed me for my brother's death. He said I was a traitor, that I had betrayed the family. He sent men after me, to kill me." Laurie listened, her heart aching for him. She understood now. The fear in his eyes, the recurring nightmare, the constant vigilance. He was a hunted man, a man living on borrowed time. "That's why you're here," she said, her voice soft. "That's why you were passing through. You were running from your father." He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I had to get away," he said. "I had to disappear. I had to start over." Laurie reached out, taking his hand, her touch sending a wave of warmth through his body. "You can start over here, Caleb," she said. "With me. You don't have to run anymore." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "But what if he finds me?" he asked. "What if he comes after me? What if he hurts you?" "He won't," Laurie said, her voice firm. "I won't let him. We'll face him together. Just like we faced Slade." He squeezed her hand, his grip tight. "I love you, Laurie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," she said, her voice unwavering. "I love you too, Caleb. And I'll always be here for you." They embraced, holding each other close, finding solace in each other's arms. The price of freedom, they knew, was eternal vigilance. But the cost of love, they were beginning to discover, was even greater. It meant facing the past, confronting the demons, and risking everything for the chance of a future together. And yet, another secret, another piece was missing. Laurie's father's past. and it related, she knew, to Caleb's. Chapter 13. Under a sky of shifting alliances. A week after Caleb's confession, a stranger arrived at the ranch. He was a tall, imposing man, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to pierce through you. He rode a magnificent black stallion, and he carried himself with an air of authority that commanded respect and a hint of danger. Lori and Caleb were working in the corral when he rode up, the dust swirling around his horse's hooves. They stopped what they were doing, their senses on high alert. "Can I help you?" Lori asked, her voice cautious. The man dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Lori, then at Caleb, his gaze lingering on Caleb for a moment longer. "My name is Silas," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I'm looking for Caleb O'Connell." Caleb stiffened, his hand instinctively moving towards the gun he carried on his hip. Lori placed a hand on his arm, a silent warning.
"Who are you?"
Caleb asked, his voice guarded. "And what do you want?" Silas smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm a friend," he said. "Or at least I used to be. I knew your brother." Caleb's eyes widened in surprise. "My brother?" Silas nodded. "We were close," he said. "We fought together. We trusted each other." He paused, his gaze turning somber. "I was there when he died," he said. "I saw what happened. I saw who killed him." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. "Who?" he whispered. "Who killed him?" Silas looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked like accusation. "It wasn't your father, Caleb," he said. "It was someone else. Someone you both trusted. Someone close to the family." He turned his gaze and looked directly, for the first time, at Lori. A cold dread washed over Lori. She knew, instinctively, what was coming. Silas continued. "The man who killed him, the man your father thought betrayed you all those years ago, went by a different name back then." Caleb's face went white. He looked at Lori, a question forming in his eyes. A terror blooming. Silas' eyes bored into Lori. He changed his identity. Became a rancher. Took a wife. Had a daughter. The world tilted on its axis for Lori. The pieces, scattered and confusing, suddenly slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Her father. The gambling.
The debts.
The connection to Caleb's family. Silas finished, the words like stones dropping into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards, destroying everything. Your father, Lori, was the man who killed Caleb's brother. The alliance shifted. The sky went dark. Chapter 14. The heart's treacherous terrain. The revelation hung in the air, a devastating blow that shattered the fragile peace they had found. Lori stared at Silas, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend the enormity of his words. Her father a murderer? The man she had loved, admired, defended a killer? Caleb looked at Lori, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, pain, and betrayal. He had trusted her, loved her, shared his deepest secrets with her. And now, he discovered that her father was the man who had destroyed his family, the man he had been running from all these years. "No," Lori whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be true. My father, he wasn't." He couldn't have. Silas shook his head, his expression somber. "I wish it weren't true, Lori," he said. "But it is. I saw it with my own eyes. Your father, he was a different man back then. He was ruthless, ambitious, driven by greed. He was involved in things that were best left buried." He explained how Lori's father had been a part of Caleb's family's organization, a trusted lieutenant, a man who had risen through the ranks through his cunning and ruthlessness. He had been tasked with expanding the family's business into new territories, into the West. But he had grown greedy, ambitious, wanting more power, more control. He had betrayed Caleb's family, orchestrating the death of Caleb's brother, framing Caleb's father, and seizing control of a lucrative part of the business. He had then fled, changing his name, reinventing himself as a rancher, burying his past under a new identity. "He used the money," Silas said, his voice filled with disgust. "He used the blood money to buy this ranch, to build a new life. A life built on lies and betrayal." Lori felt a wave of nausea, a surge of anger and shame. She had idolized her father, had defended his memory, had fought to protect his legacy. And now, she discovered that he was a monster, a man who had destroyed lives, a man who had built his happiness on the suffering of others. She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear I didn't know. Caleb didn't reply. He stood there, silent and still, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. He had opened his heart to her, had trusted her with his deepest secrets, and she had, unknowingly, betrayed him. He turned and walked away, his steps slow and heavy. He walked towards the barn, disappearing inside, leaving Lori standing alone, the weight of her father's sins crushing her. She didn't know what to do, where to go, how to fix this. She had lost Caleb, lost his trust, his love, his respect. She had lost everything. She had defended a lie. She sat down on the porch, her body trembling, her mind racing. She thought of her father, of his charming smile, his loving embrace, his unwavering optimism. She tried to reconcile the image she had of him with the monster Silas had described. But she couldn't. The evidence was too strong, the truth too painful. Her father had been a liar, a cheat, a murderer. And she had been his unwitting accomplice, his defender, his victim. The terrain, she thought, was treacherous indeed. The heart knew no boundaries. Chapter 15. When trust wears a tarnished spur, Lori found Caleb in the barn, grooming his horse, his movements mechanical, his face devoid of emotion. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. Caleb, she said, her voice trembling.
Please talk to me.
He continued to brush the horse, his silence a heavy, suffocating presence. I know I can't change what happened, she said. I can't undo my father's sins. But I love you, Caleb. And I had nothing to do with it.
I swear.
He finally stopped, turning to look at her, his eyes filled with a pain that cut her to the core. How can I believe you, Lori? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. How can I trust you? Your father, he destroyed my family. He killed my brother. And you defended him. You protected his legacy. I didn't know. She cried, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know the truth. I believed in him. I loved him.
And now?
He asked, his voice cold. Do you still love him? Do you still defend him? Lori shook her head, her heart breaking. No, she whispered. I don't know what to feel.
I'm disgusted. I'm ashamed. I'm heartbroken.
He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to find a flicker of sincerity, a hint of truth. But the trust was gone, shattered by the revelation of her father's past. The spur, once shining with the promise of love, was now tarnished, its sharp edges cutting deep. I need time, Lori, he said, his voice weary. I need space. I need to figure things out. What does that mean? She asked, her voice filled with fear. Are you leaving? He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor.
I don't know, he said.
I don't know what I'm going to do. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the barn, the silence deafening, the emptiness overwhelming. She watched him go, her heart sinking, her hopes fading. She had lost him. She had lost his love, his trust, his companionship. And she had no one to blame but herself and her father. She spent the next few days in a daze, going through the motions of ranch life, but her heart wasn't in it. The joy was gone, the purpose extinguished. She felt empty, lost, adrift in a sea of guilt and regret. She tried to talk to Silas, to learn more about her father's past, to understand what had driven him to become the man he had been. But Silas was evasive, reluctant to reveal any more details. It's better if you don't know, Lori, he said. Some things are best left buried. But Lori couldn't let it go. She needed to know the truth, the whole truth, no matter how painful it might be. She needed to understand her father, to come to terms with his actions, to find a way to move forward. She started to search, digging through her father's belongings, looking for any clues, any hints, any evidence that might shed light on his past. She found old letters, documents, photographs, each one a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of a life she had never known. She discovered that her father had been involved in more than just the one incident with Caleb's family. He had been a part of a larger network of crime, a web of deceit and violence that stretched across the country. He had been a ruthless, ambitious man, driven by greed and power. The more she learned, the more disgusted she became. She couldn't believe that the man she had loved and admired had been capable of such cruelty, such treachery. The trust was gone, not only with Caleb, but with her own past. The spur, she felt, was digging into her now. Chapter 16. Flames of Rebellion, Ashes of Regret. Lori's search led her to an old, abandoned shack on the outskirts of the ranch, a place her father had forbidden her to go near when she was a child. She'd always assumed it was just an old storage shed, a place where he kept tools and supplies. But now, she suspected it held something more, something connected to his past. She went there one evening, under the cover of darkness, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The shack was dilapidated, the wood rotting, the windows broken. The door was unlocked, creaking open as she pushed it inward. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The only light came from the moon, filtering through the cracks in the walls, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Lori lit a kerosene lamp, the flickering flame revealing the contents of the shack. It wasn't a storage shed. It was a hideout. There were maps on the walls, marked with various locations, routes, and names. There were weapons, guns, knives, ammunition hidden in crates and under blankets. And there were documents, stacks of papers, letters, ledgers, detailing her father's illegal activities. Lori began to read, her heart sinking with each revelation. She discovered the details of her father's crimes, the names of his victims, the extent of his betrayal. She found evidence of his dealings with Caleb's family, the plans for the murder of Caleb's brother, the forged documents, the stolen money. She found a letter, written by her father, addressed to someone named Silas. It was a confession, a desperate plea for forgiveness, a recognition of his own sins. "I know I've done terrible things," he wrote. "I've betrayed my friends, my family, my own conscience. I've become a monster, a man I no longer recognize. I'm haunted by my actions, by the ghosts of those I've wronged. I pray for redemption, for a chance to make amends, but I know it's too late. I'm trapped in a web of my own making, and I can see no way out." Lori felt a wave of conflicting emotions, disgust, anger, pity, and understanding. She saw her father, not as a monster, but as a flawed human being, a man who had made terrible choices, a man who had been consumed by his own demons. She found another letter, this one addressed to her. It was dated just a few weeks before his death. "My dearest Lori," he wrote, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means you've discovered the truth about me. I'm ashamed of what I've done, of the life I've led. I wanted to protect you from it, to shield you from the darkness. But I know I can't hide it forever. I hope you can forgive me, Lori. I hope you can find it in your heart to understand. I loved you more than anything in the world. And I always will." Tears streamed down Lori's face as she read the letter. She felt a pang of grief, a sense of loss for the father she had thought she knew, and a surge of anger for the man he had actually been. She understood now, his gambling, his debts, his desperation. He had been trying to escape his past, to build a new life, but he had been trapped by his own sins, haunted by his own demons. Suddenly, a noise outside startled her. She quickly blew out the lamp, plunging the shack into darkness. She heard footsteps, voices, approaching the shack. She grabbed a rifle, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Caleb and Silas. They had followed her. "Lori," Caleb called out, his voice filled with concern. "Are you in there? What are you doing?" Lori hesitated, unsure of what to do. She had found the truth, but she didn't know if she was ready to share it, especially with Caleb. The flames of rebellion, she realized, had left only ashes of regret. She had no idea if this new truth would drive them further apart or bring them together. Chapter 17. A Reckoning Under the Desert Moon. Lori stepped out of the shack, the rifle still in her hands, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. Caleb and Silas stood before her, their expressions a mixture of concern and suspicion. "What were you doing in there, Lori?" Caleb asked, his voice tight. "That's your father's old hideout, isn't it?" Lori nodded, her gaze fixed on the ground. I needed to know the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "I needed to understand him." She handed Caleb the letters, the confession, the evidence of her father's crimes. He took them, his hands shaking, his eyes scanning the faded ink. Silas watched him, his expression unreadable. As Caleb read, his face changed, the anger and betrayal fading, replaced by a mixture of sadness, understanding, and something else. Something that looked like relief. He regretted it, Caleb said, his voice hoarse. He regretted what he did. He wanted forgiveness. Lori nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "He was a flawed man, Caleb," she said. "He made terrible choices. But he wasn't all bad. He loved me. He tried to protect me." Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with a newfound tenderness. He reached out, taking her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her body. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "I understand. I forgive him, Lori. And I forgive you." Lori's heart soared. She had feared she had lost him forever, that the truth would drive them apart. But instead, it had brought them closer, forging a bond of understanding and forgiveness. Silas stepped forward, his gaze shifting between Lori and Caleb. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice low and serious. "Something about your father, Caleb. Something I didn't tell you before." Caleb looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Silas hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Your father, he knew," he said. "He knew about Lori's father. He knew who he was, what he had done." Caleb's breath caught in his throat.
"What?" he whispered.
How is that possible?" Silas explained that Caleb's father had discovered the truth about Lori's father years ago, after Caleb had fled. He had tracked him down, confronted him, but he hadn't killed him. He had spared his life, offering him a chance to make amends, to confess his sins, to seek forgiveness. He believed in redemption, Silas said. He believed that everyone deserved a second chance. He wanted to give your father that chance. He wanted to break the cycle of violence. Caleb was stunned, his mind reeling from this new revelation. His father, the man he had believed to be ruthless and unforgiving, had shown mercy, compassion, forgiveness. He never told me," Caleb said, his voice choked with emotion. Silas shook his head.
"He wanted to protect you," he said.
"He didn't want you to know the truth. He didn't want you to hate him." Lori looked at Caleb, her heart aching for him. He had carried the burden of his father's supposed betrayal for so long, had lived with the pain and the anger, and now he discovered that his father had been a better man than he had ever imagined. Caleb looked at Lori, his eyes filled with tears. I misjudged him," he said. "I misjudged them both." He embraced Lori, holding her tight, finding solace in her arms. The reckoning, under the desert moon, had been painful, but it had also been cathartic. It had cleared the air, healed the wounds, and paved the way for a new beginning. The truth, like the desert, was harsh, unforgiving, but ultimately cleansing. Chapter 18. The Ghosts of Promises Broken. The revelation of both fathers' pasts brought a sense of closure, a release from the burdens that had weighed so heavily on Lori and Caleb. They had faced the truth, confronted the ghosts of promises broken, and emerged stronger, their love deepened by the shared experience of forgiveness and understanding. They decided to honor the memory of Caleb's father, his act of mercy, his belief in redemption. They would rebuild the ranch, not just as a business, but as a symbol of hope, a place where people could find a second chance, a place where the cycle of violence could be broken. Silas, having fulfilled his promise to Caleb's father, decided to stay, to help them with the ranch, to become a part of their new family. He had his own demons to contend with, his own regrets to overcome, and he found solace in the work, in the companionship, in the shared purpose. They held a small ceremony, a private memorial for both their fathers, acknowledging their flaws, their mistakes, but also their humanity, their capacity for love, their desire for redemption. They buried the letters, the evidence of their past, alongside them, letting go of the anger, the bitterness, the resentment. As they stood by the graves, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the land, Lori felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. She had found love, forgiveness, and a new purpose in life. She had faced the darkness and emerged into the light. Caleb took her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her body. "We'll do it together, Lori," he said, his voice filled with love and determination. "We'll build a new future, a better future." She nodded, her eyes meeting his, her heart filled with hope. "Together," she whispered. The days that followed were filled with hard work, but also with joy, with laughter, with the quiet contentment of shared lives and shared dreams. They repaired the fences, rebuilt the barn, restocked the cattle, and transformed the ranch into a thriving, vibrant community. They welcomed new workers, drifters, outlaws, anyone who was looking for a second chance, a place to belong, a place to start over. They offered them work, shelter, and most importantly, respect and understanding. The ranch became known as a haven, a sanctuary, a place where the past didn't matter, where only the present and the future counted. It was a testament to the power of forgiveness, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring strength of love. But the ghosts of the past, though laid to rest, still lingered, their whispers echoing in the wind. Lori and Caleb knew that they could never fully escape their history, that the scars would always remain. But they had learned to live with them, to draw strength from them, to use them as a reminder of the importance of compassion, understanding, and forgiveness. One promise, however, remained. The promise of a future, and the reality of their feelings. Chapter 19. Where Honor and Heartbreak Collide. Years passed, filled with the rhythm of ranch life, the changing seasons, the joys and sorrows of a community built on second chances. Lori and Caleb's love deepened, becoming a beacon of hope and stability for everyone around them. They had created a sanctuary, a place where broken souls could heal, where lost dreams could be rekindled. But even in paradise, shadows linger. Caleb, despite his happiness with Lori, still carried the weight of his past, the unspoken question of his father's legacy, the unfinished business of his former life. He had found peace, but not complete resolution. One day, a rider arrived, a young man with familiar eyes, carrying a letter sealed with the crest of Caleb's family. He was a messenger, sent by Caleb's father's successor, the new head of the organization. The letter was an invitation, a summons, a request for Caleb to return, to attend a gathering, a reconciliation of sorts. Caleb was torn. He had built a new life, a life he loved, with Lori. He had no desire to return to the darkness, the violence, the world he had left behind. But he also felt a sense of obligation, a duty to his family, to his father's memory, to the legacy he had abandoned. He shared the letter with Lori, his heart heavy with apprehension. He expected her to be afraid, to beg him not to go, to fear for his safety and their future. But Lori surprised him. "You have to go, Caleb," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "You have to face your past, to find closure, to make peace with who you are and where you came from." He looked at her, his eyes filled with love and admiration. "But what about us?" he asked. "What about the ranch? What about everything we've built?" "We'll be here," she said, her voice unwavering. "Waiting for you. This ranch, it's not just a place, Caleb. It's an idea. It's a belief in second chances. And that will endure, with or without you. But you need this. You need to close this chapter of your life." He knew she was right. He had to go. He had to face his past, to honor his father's memory, to find his own peace. But the thought of leaving Lori, of risking their happiness, filled him with a dread he hadn't felt since he'd fled his former life. He embraced her, holding her tight, his heart aching with the fear of separation. "I love you, Lori," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "More than anything in the world." "And I love you, Caleb," she said, her voice unwavering.
Go.
Find your peace. And come back to me. He rode away the next morning, under a sky heavy with clouds, the wind whispering through the dry grasses, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of rain. Lori watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She knew he would face challenges, that he might be tempted to stay, to return to his old life. But she also knew that he loved her, that he had found something precious on the ranch, something worth fighting for. She trusted him. She believed in him. And she knew that their love, forged in the crucible of hardship and forgiveness, would endure. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a nagging doubt began to creep into her heart. The collision, she knew, was not just with honor, but with potential heartbreak. He hadn't returned. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Months turned into a year, and still, there was no word from Caleb. Lori kept the ranch running, her heart aching with his absence, her hope dwindling with each passing day. She clung to the belief that he would return, that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, but the silence was deafening, the emptiness overwhelming. Silas watched her, his concern growing, his own past regrets weighing heavily on his heart. He knew the pain of loss, the agony of waiting, the crushing weight of unanswered questions. He tried to offer comfort, to reassure her, but he also knew the reality of Caleb's former life, the dangers he faced, the temptations he might encounter. One evening, as Lori sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and trepidation. It couldn't be, could it? As the rider drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was Caleb. He was different, changed, his face weathered, his eyes holding a depth of experience that hadn't been there before. But he was alive. He was back. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on Lori. He walked towards her, his steps hesitant, his expression a mixture of relief, love, and something else. Something that looked like guilt. "Lori," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes searching hers. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, holding him tight, tears streaming down her face. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're back. You're finally back." He held her close, his body trembling, his heart pounding against hers. "I'm sorry, Lori," he said, his voice filled with regret.
I'm so sorry.
I should have written. I should have, it doesn't matter," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're here. That's all that matters." They stood there for a long moment, lost in each other's embrace, the world fading away around them. The silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing, the beating of their hearts, the whispers of the wind. He pulled back slightly, his eyes meeting hers, his expression filled with a mixture of love and apology. "I had to stay," he explained. "There were things I had to do. Things I had to settle. My father's legacy, it wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. There were people who depended on me, responsibilities I couldn't ignore." He told her about the gathering, the reconciliation, the challenges he had faced. He had confronted his past, made peace with his family, and taken on a new role, a leadership position that would allow him to use his influence for good, to steer the organization away from violence and towards a more legitimate path. "I had to make a choice, Lori," he said, "between my past and my future, between my family and you." Lori's heart sank. She knew what was coming. He had chosen his family, his legacy, his past. He had chosen not her. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. You have to do what you think is right." He reached out, taking her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "But I did choose you, Lori," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I chose you. I always choose you." He explained that he had found a way to bridge the two worlds, to balance his responsibilities with his love for her. He had negotiated an agreement, a compromise that would allow him to spend time with her on the ranch, while still fulfilling his obligations to his family.
It won't be easy, he said.
There will be challenges, separations, risks. But I'm willing to do it, Lori. If you'll have me. Lori looked at him, her eyes filled with love and relief. She had feared she had lost him, that the past had claimed him, but he had found a way, a path that would allow them to be together. Of course, I'll have you, Caleb, she said, her voice unwavering. Always. They embraced, holding each other tight, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope, a deeper understanding of the complexities of love, forgiveness, and second chances. The final confrontation had not been a battle, but a resolution, a merging of two worlds, two hearts, two destinies. The horizons stretched before them, vast and uncertain, but together, they would face them, hand in hand, their love a beacon of strength and resilience in the ever-changing landscape of their lives. This was the final resolution, the final truth. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to their enduring love, a tapestry woven with threads of joy and sorrow, challenge and triumph. Caleb divided his time between the ranch and his responsibilities to his family, navigating the treacherous terrain between two worlds, his heart always tethered to Lori and the sanctuary they had created together. They faced challenges, threats from those who opposed Caleb's new direction, remnants of his father's enemies who sought revenge. But they faced them together, their love a shield against the darkness, their combined strength a force to be reckoned with. The ranch flourished, becoming a symbol of hope and redemption, a place where people from all walks of life could find a second chance, a place where the past could be forgiven, if not forgotten. They welcomed new arrivals, shared their stories, and built a community founded on trust, respect, and the enduring power of love. Lori and Caleb never had children of their own, but they became surrogate parents to many, offering guidance, support, and unconditional love to those who had lost their way. They found fulfillment in nurturing others, in helping them heal, in watching them grow and thrive. As they grew older, their love deepened, becoming a quiet, unwavering force that anchored them to each other and to the land. They had weathered storms, faced demons, and overcome obstacles, their bond strengthened by each trial, their hearts intertwined forever. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in a breathtaking display of color, Caleb took Lori's hand, his touch still sending a shiver of warmth through her body. "We did it, Lori," he said, his voice filled with love and gratitude. "We built a good life, a meaningful life." She smiled, her eyes meeting his, her heart overflowing with love. "Together," she whispered. "We did it together." They sat in silence, their hands clasped, their hearts content, the vast expanse of the sky above them a reflection of the infinite possibilities of their love, a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness, second chances, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. The dust had settled, the debts were paid, and all that remained was the enduring, quiet, and profound power of their love, a love born in the heart of the frontier, a love that would last forever.